Hi, welcome to Species and Population Notes. You're going to want to do answer the questions via Google Forms while watching these notes. You can do one of two things. You can check out all the questions and write them down and then take notes while you watch. You can have two screens open, or you can answer the questions when you're done. Do what works for you, but you do need to answer these questions. So we're going to start with some vocabulary words. The word ecology is the study of living organisms and their interaction with the non-living environment. So you might remember this from bio, but eco means house and ology is study of. So for example, physiology is the study of the physio or the body, okay? And when we're talking about ecology, there's some other words that we need to be aware of. Biotic and abiotic. Bio means life and a means not. So biotic is the living portions of the ecosystem and abiotic is the non-living portions of the ecosystem. So when we're looking at ecology, we're looking at both the living and the non-living portions of the ecosystem. When talking about ecology, there's a certain level in which we're talking about. So in ecology, we're looking at things above the population level. We're not looking at individual organisms. We're not looking at body systems, anything on the cellular level, but we're looking at populations, okay? And a population is a group of organisms of the same species living at the same place at the same time. So group of organisms, same species, same place, and same time. Those three components. So over here we have a pride of lions, all of the same species, living in the savanna, same place, and today, so same time. So again, when we're looking at ecology, we're looking at communities, ecosystems, and the ecosphere, okay? Things above the population level. So looking at different populations of organisms living at the same place at the same time, which is the community. So we want to start with an example when we're talking about niches, okay? So the Chesapeake Bay, which is in the East Coast, is set up basically, it's a bay, so it's saltwater and freshwater meeting together. So there's a salinity gradient because the freshwater is flowing into the bay. So you have three communities that make up that ecosystem. You have the river community, which is freshwater, the estuary, which is brackish, and the bay, which is saltwater. We definitely, in the Bay Area, are familiar with this. Now, each organism has its own niche, its own very specific role. So what a niche is, and this is another definition you need to be aware of, is an organism's home, its space in response to food, the predators that it is in contact with, the competition it has both within its own species and with other species, and the resources available to it. So again, the organisms that live in the Chesapeake Bay have a very specific niche or niche, depending the British or the American pronunciation, because it has to adapt to like slightly salty, slightly fresh water, and depending on how far up the river or how far into the bay you are, it determines how much salt versus fresh water. So again, very specific niches. Now, things that limit how much an organism can thrive is called a limiting factor. And it's a huge factor in defining an organism's niche because it determines how much food it has or the resources available to it or the space that it has available to it. So for example, tall trees cannot grow in the water because water is a very big limiting factor in desert ecosystems. Can you think of another limiting factor in the desert? Think about it and write it down. If you need more time, pause the video and keep thinking. If you've thought about it, then some things that might come to mind are shade, Other things that might come to mind are soil. Other things that might come to mind are temperature gradients. Okay, so these are just a few other limiting factors that exist in deserts. When we're looking at the Chesapeake Bay salt marsh, what I want you guys to think about is what can be the limiting factors for the clapper rail, this bird. Now, this bird, looking at its beak, it eats fish, small reptiles, and insects, okay? So thinking about that, pause this video and write down as many limiting factors as you can think of. Okay, so when we're thinking about the organisms, the limiting factors that you can think of are the organisms that are adapted to that ecosystem. So examples of limiting factors for the clapper rail would be the trout, the bass, the frogs, the turtles, the voles, the aquatic insects, and the ducks. These are the things that are all its food, right? In this diagram, it doesn't have so much of a predator except for the parasitic insects, okay? But beyond that, there's not really much of a predator for the clapper rail in this ecosystem. However, if it runs out of any of these foods, or if it runs out of grass to hide in from other larger predators, such as hawks and things like that, then it is in trouble. Or if the water gets polluted. So part of the river ecosystem was the organisms that are part of the food for the clapper rail. The clapper rail has other food as well. So one of the things that it's well adapted to this ecosystem. So in the estuary portion of the ecosystem, another vocab word, other words for estuary are brackish, salt marsh, basically anything that's adapted to low salinity, meaning there is some salt water. It's not only fresh water. So things that are best adapted for this part of the ecosystem are the cordgrass, the periwinkles, birds. Not birds. Those are plants. Seaside sparrows, shorebirds, horseflies, mosquito fish. Okay. These are well adapted to slightly salty ecosystems. Now, the bay portion of the ecosystem are those adapted to high salinity. So its specific niche is places that have almost ocean level salinity waters. Okay, so this is the crab, the mullet fish, croaker, flatfish, anchovies, gulls. It makes sense that these are the aquatic organisms. So when looking at this diagram, think about the biotic and abiotic factors. Pause the video and identify all the abiotic and biotic factors. Write these answers in your Google form. Okay, welcome back. So let's go through this. So some abiotic factors, non-living factors, are the water, the salt, the air, the atmosphere, soil, which is, there's some biotic factors in soil, but soil, the particles that make up soil, and the various nutrients. We also have sunlight, we have wind, we have precipitation, even though those can't be readily seen. Now, all the organisms you see, all the fish, all the crustaceans, the reptiles, the mammals, the birds, the insects, the plants, all that are biotic factors. Okay? Abiotic, not living, biotic, living. When we're talking about interaction amongst organisms, we're kind of switching gears a little bit. We are basically going to talk about 5 major categories. There are more, but these are the 5 big ones. So we're going to talk about competition, predation, herbivory, parasitism, and mutualism. Now, when we're talking about interaction amongst organisms, we have 2 different categories. One is intraspecific competition. Intra means within, so within the same species, and this is the most intense. So as we know in humans, the competition we have within our own species tends to manifest in things like war, right? Pretty intense. Same with the battle for mating rights. Again, very intense. This is the situation in which we tend to kill our own species. Okay, so interspecific competition, pretty intense. Means within different. So interspecific competition is with different organisms, okay? And it's less intense because each organism has a different niche or slightly different requirements for living. So when there is competition, you have three choices, okay? When you are, whether it's inter or intraspecific competition, you can leave, you can emigrate out of that area, you can die, which is also known as extinction, or you can adapt, which a major example of that is resource partitioning or sharing. So here's a real life version of this, okay? So these are two birds of the same species living in the same tree, but they're gonna partition, okay? So they're going to solve the problem. These are all different types of warblers, and they live in conifers, okay? And what they have done, essentially, is they have, to avoid competition for food and space in the same area, they have resource partitioned. They have divvied up the tree. So the yellow rumped warblers, they inhabit the lower portion of the tree and eat the stuff over here and live over here. The bay-breasted warbler kind of takes a middle bottom. They eat the stuff there, live there. Black-throated green warbler, they eat the stuff and live here. Black Burnian warbler lives in the almost towards the top, and the Cape May warbler at the top. So now they're sharing the tree, but they have their own little spot. Over time, they will become their own subspecies. So here's another thing that can happen, right? If two organisms are competing and they have the similar requirements, they cannot occupy the same exact niche. This is called Gauss's law. So two species with similar requirements cannot occupy the same niche. This is interspecific competitions, two different species, okay? Intra, two of the same species, they can occupy the same niche, and that's why their competition is so much more fierce. So let's look at Gauss's law in action. So we're looking at paramecium, okay? This is a single-celled organism. And we have Paramecium aurelia alone. So x-axis is days and y-axis is relative population density. So you put them in a petri dish, give them a bunch of food, the petri dish is their space, and how long does it take for them to replicate? Well, we know the carrying capacity in that petri dish is about 100, right? After 100, the population can't sustain itself, so it hovers below 100. Now, Paramecium caudatum by itself, again, petri dish, food, and time. Okay, so here's time, here's population density. And its carrying capacity is somewhere around 70, 65, 70. Above that, population, they seem like they're a little hungrier. They might use up more of their resources. Now, if you put them together, remember, my hypothesis is that these guys are hungrier because, again, look, their population density is lower given the same amount of food and space. Okay, so when together, the Aurelia actually does much better, and as a result, the Caudatum goes extinct in that petri dish. They cannot occupy the same exact niche. So one is going to, so to speak, win, okay? And this is going to be important for when we talk about all the changes that happens over time, okay? Competitive exclusion tends to reduce the carrying capacity for both organisms since they both need the same resource, which is finite. So again, they're both duking it out for the same resources. So now let's talk about the different types of predator-prey relation, or different types of relationships between organisms, okay, the interactions amongst organisms. So we had competition, and the next category is predation. So this is when a member of the predator species prey on a member of the prey species, but they do not live in or on the prey. We will talk about that. So this is a deep sea organism fish, super awesomely ugly, and it is quite a fierce predator. So predators have certain strategies, certain characteristics. If you didn't know if something was a predator, you can probably figure it out based on certain characteristics. So they tend to have structural advantages such as natural weapons like fangs and claws and flexible body so that they can kind of maneuver themselves in and out of situations to get their prey. They also tend to be larger. Okay, so for example, within their category of organisms, they tend to be on the large side. Some of them do ambush. They stalk a victim, right, like the lynx. Okay. Some gape and suck. So for example, this fish, they open their mouth and then just like slurp up everything in their path. Many have very keen eyesight, and oftentimes they have venom, right? Most of them are pretty fast and stealth-like, so speed and cunning. So they tend to be more intelligent than their prey, and they can run faster than they prey. And oftentimes they hunt in packs, so they tend to be more social. So this is prey strategy. So how do they not get eaten? Okay, so there's 4 big categories. So they have defense techniques, which include all of these: inflate, flee, fight back, stab, poison. Structural advantages, hard body covers like the tortoise, thorns or spines like cactus, breakaway body parts like nudibranchs, and natural weapons like bees. Okay, they do chemical warfare, blinding ink, poison. These nudibranchs have poison on them. They have terrible smells and tastes, so like the predator's like, well, I don't want this at all. They can oftentimes camouflage, hide out. They have counter shading, so that way they're just hard to spot. And disruptive patterns, such as zebras, when they're all together, they confuse lions. All the stripes just make the lion's eyes go bonkers and they can't focus on a prey. And they also have mimicry. Well, they look like something else that is really good at being poisonous or have like some crazy defense technique. So when we're talking about organisms, we're basically looking at 2 different types of reproductive strategies. So things can be R-selected or K-selected. K-selected species tend to be oftentimes those species that are going to reproduce relatively slowly. And so the number of individuals start out slow because their reproductive rate is low. They tend to have more parental care, but then eventually they reach carrying capacity, overshoot slightly, there's a die-off period, and then they go under carrying capacity, they start doing well again, and then they just hover somewhere below carrying capacity, which is the greatest number that niche can support, okay? So carrying capacity is the maximum that part of the ecosystem can support of that organism. On the flip side, we have R-selected, which is a J curve, okay? Because it looks like the letter J. So again, time, the number of species. These guys tend to have very little parental care, so they just like reproduce, and then they tend to overshoot because they reproduce so quickly, and then there's a collapse and oftentimes a huge dieback. If it goes to 0, like the paramecium that died out, then it's going to go extinct in either that ecosystem or on Earth. But if it basically regenerates before hitting 0, then the population is going to have a huge dieback, but then do this process again down the line. So that results in some predator and prey feedback systems, okay? So if you click on this graph, there's a video that I'm going to have you guys watch. And it's a video about the lynx hunting the hare. So let's look at that real quick. Oh no, is it going to let me do it? Ah. Okay, I'll come back. Oh, there it is. Oh, being patient. There we go. Beautiful animal. So that's our predator species, the lynx. It has big paws which act like snowshoes. And the prey species, if you notice, it has camouflage. Its color is white, so it blends in with the snow. Now the lynx is very rare because it preys almost entirely on snow hares. Super rare predator. What are you rooting for? All right, so the video shows you the actual lynx and the actual snow hare. Now, what we have here is a boom and bust cycle, okay? It's a 10-year cycle. And this is data that this is a super classic example of predator and prey feedback system. So there's positive and negative feedback that's happening over time, okay? So the positive feedback is for the predator. And when the prey species population goes up, there's a ton of food. And now, over time, the predator species has a ton of food too. Then eventually, there's a negative feedback, bringing it back down to homeostasis. When the prey population falls, there's not very much food, right? We see there's the hare numbers are going down. And there's a lag time because you know, again, it takes a while for the lynx to for the lynx population to not have enough food and then not be able to reproduce, or populations of lynx dying out. So there's a lag time, which is why you see the red line, which is the lynx, lag slightly by a couple of years behind the blue line, which is the hare. So again, positive feedback, both populations go up when there's a lot of food. And when there isn't a lot of food, well, the prey population is going down because it got eaten, and then as a result, the lynx population goes down. So they're tightly linked to one another. Again, the lynx pretty much only eats the hare, so it is entirely dependent on the hare. A keystone species is basically a member of a community that is a key member of that community, and it needs certain limited resources. So it's super dependent on something in that ecosystem. And a keystone species is a critical element when describing an ecosystem. So for example, when you're doing your biome project, you want to identify the keystone species. Now, here's the thing. The keystone species is oftentimes not the most abundant organism, but it is often a predator. It keeps the ecosystem in check. So for example, the California sea otter. When the sea otter populations got decimated, the entire ecosystem just started to go out of whack. Okay, what the sea otter does is it eats the mussels, and the mussels eat the sea stars. The sea stars eat the kelp, and what we found was without the sea otters, the kelp was being decimated. So basically, the base of the food chain, all the plants were being decimated because the sea otters were keeping the entire rest of the food chain in check. Same is true of owls. They keep the rodent population and as well as a whole bunch of other things in check. And the rodents tend to squirrel away. Haha, get it? Squirrel away seeds and nuts. So if they squirrel away too many seeds and nuts, now there's not enough seeds and nuts that are going to grow into plants. So owls are also major keystone species. Critical keystone species is the gray wolf. And this is key to conservation efforts. So the gray wolf in Yellowstone Park basically keeps the entire ecosystem in check. You guys are going to read an article. We're going to do a lot with the gray wolf, so just kind of keep it in your head. We're not going to watch this video right now because when we do the reading, I will have you guys watch this video. But the gray wolves are absolutely critical to the health of Yosemite as well as other major places. Mutualism is when both species benefit. So rhinos and the oxpeckers. So what the oxpeckers do is they eat all the bugs that are parasitic onto the rhinos. Now, the rhinos are one of the fiercest animals on Earth. And so the oxpeckers have a pretty cush spot to hang out. Like, they're not going to get messed with. And the oxpeckers eat all the bugs that are messing with the rhino's skin. So it's a win-win situation. So mutualism is when both species benefits. Plants and fungi, another mutualistic relationship. Plants provide a home. Fungi provides nutrients for the plants. Ants and the acacia. So the acacia tree provides a home for the ants. The ants make it so that other insects don't eat the acacia tree. And pollination. Bees are getting pollen, and the plants are getting their pollen, also known as sperm, spread from plant to plant. Both benefit. Rhizobia is an example. So I want to talk about this one as an example of mutualism, because we're going to talk about this bacteria quite a bit. So this is a symbiotic bacteria found on the nodules of legumes, so like beans and soybeans and peas. And nodules are these little nubbins that are on the roots, okay? And this is a microscopic view of the bacteria that exists in the nodules of the plant. And what these bacteria do is they fix, or they take nitrogen from the soil and make it usable for the plants. This is the only way plants can get nitrogen. And plants are the source of nitrogen, essentially, meaning animals get their nitrogen from plants. Rhizobia are the world's natural nitrogen fertilizers. They are naturally putting the nitrogen, naturally getting the nitrogen from the atmosphere and then putting that nitrogen into a usable form for the plants. So they are super duper, like superheroes. We should put capes on these little guys. All right, the last one, parasitism, kind of gnarly. There's always a positive and benefit relationship, meaning one organism totally benefits and the other one totally does not. So the parasite benefits and the host loses. And usually the parasites are much smaller than the host. So here is a nematode, a worm, a tapeworm, in intestines. And this is what it looks like. So this is basically feeding off of the nutrients of the individual's intestines. The individual's not getting the nutrients. Their stomach is getting bloated literally by worms. And the worms are taking all the nutrients that that individual or that mammal should be getting. These are the end of our notes. Make sure you go back and do your Google Forms. And any questions that are confusing, write them down and your teacher will answer them in class. Enjoy!